So, in the final lecture of Unit 3, we're going to take a look into how the institution of slavery was tied up with the political system of the United States in what historians have recently started calling the First Republic, or the period between the American Revolution and 1865, which was a very sort of distinct period of American history where slavery comes to dominate the politics of the United States by the 1850s. And in this particular lecture, I'm going to try to keep this lecture fairly short and focused on that individual question. So we will go over some of the Jacksonian era, but I'm going to try to encourage you to do a little bit of the voluntary reading if you want to know a little bit more about some of Jackson's other policies, which we're not going to go over in this lecture. So the goals for the class today are to first understand how slavery is entwined with the political system of the First Republic, because prominent white plantation owners and pro-slavery politicians had substantial advantages in the U.S. political system between the Constitution and the Civil War. Second, I want you to be able to understand and explain how did slavery change over time as an institution, due to sort of the emergence of cotton as a new as an important cash crop in the 1800s. And then lastly, I want you to be able to understand the causes and the consequences of the Indian Removal Act, because it was the sort of signature legislation of Andrew Jackson, and had some very important consequences in terms of the expansion of slavery into the Southwest. So in our last lecture, we briefly discussed slavery at the end of the Civil War. So what did slavery as an institution look like in 1800? So emancipation did occur in most of the states in New England. Connecticut holds on to slavery until the 1820s, 1830s, because they adopt a sort of very stringent gradual emancipation plan, which leads to actually some people still actually being enslaved in Connecticut in the 1830s. But for the most part, in New England, people are freed pretty quickly, and you have actually free African American communities in New England towns and cities, and African Americans make up around 5% of the population in New England, and upwards of 10% of the population in Rhode Island. Meanwhile, the middle colonies, I say middle colonies, I should say middle states at this point, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, there is gradual emancipation. So slavery does get abolished, but it takes a little bit longer for slavery to be abolished. And only in Pennsylvania is actually slavery immediately abolished, right during the American Revolution. And so, but nonetheless, these states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, are much more like New England in that by 1830, 1840, these are not states where slavery really exists for the most part, just in little small pockets and corners. So for the most part, societies are free societies in the North. In the South, however, slavery continues. And it not only continues, but it expands as an institution and actually becomes more important to those states, to places like Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And it moves west as the United States moves west into regions like Kentucky and Tennessee. And so also see slavery undergoes some very important changes between 1800 and 1820. And most political leaders at the time, around 1800, there's an understanding among political elites that slavery would just quietly ended over time. So a lot of the people who are called the founding fathers, and I don't really like that term, it doesn't accurately describe American history, but Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, John Adams, all these people agreed that slavery was going to eventually die as an institution, and so they didn't really concern themselves as much with policies on slavery. But again, there are some major technological changes that actually increases the relevance of slavery to American society after 1800. So one very important invention that I'm sure you've heard of in your high school history classes is that of the cotton gin. And so the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney in 1799. And it was a machine, it was a tool for processing cotton. And why is this such a big deal? Well, you need, in order to produce cotton, you need people to go out and to pick cotton from cotton plants. And that's a sort of a very difficult task. Cotton plants are very thorny. It's actually kind of it's back-breaking labor, and you have to have also a very delicate touch and also be very very quick with getting out cotton directly from the plants. And but then what you get from cotton plants is also filled with seeds. And so you actually need to process that and take all the seeds out before it can be sent to textile factories and then made into clothing. And so the cotton gin, you had to have people manually go through and pick out these seeds. And it was a very hard work and a very long it made it very difficult and time consuming, and this made creating cotton plantations as sort of a more niche economic activity. You couldn't make a lot of money in it because it required tons of time investment. But with the cotton gin, suddenly you could actually feed all of this raw cotton through this machine, which would automatically like de-seed the cotton. And so it is a massive labor-saving tool. However, you still need people to go out and pick that cotton from cotton plants, right? So in this way, the cotton gin still requires a large enslaved population, at least the way the American South practiced cash crops. At least it requires a good deal of labor. But because of cotton gin, you can, again, feed it through the system and be able to actually produce a substantial amount of cotton, sell it for a big profit, right? And so what it in fact does is it makes creating cotton plantations as suddenly very economically feasible, and not only economically feasible, but economically incredibly profitable over other crops like tobacco or rice. And the other advantage of cotton is it can be grown out west, away from the coast. Rice does not grow that well in non sort of humid environments, and it has to have very sort of specific soil in order to grow. And tobacco as well doesn't grow well in specific soil. But cotton could be grown throughout most of the soils throughout the American South. And so the cotton gin gives a strong financial incentive for planters to both want more land and to expand plantations and enslave more people. So in the 1850s and 60s, Republican politicians who were anti-slavery stated that the country was sort of hijacked by this thing they called the slave power. And what they meant by that is that people at the most prominent positions in the federal government were pro-slavery and were using the federal institutions to perpetuate and expand slavery, not only in the United States, but also around the world. And historians have kind of looked at this and kind of said, oh, this was sort of a conspiracy theory thought up by Republicans in the 1850s and 1860s. And this was common. Remember, we talked in the last lecture about sort of conspiracy theories in early American politics and how many political parties sort of had different paranoias and conspiracy theories that drove their politics. But recently, historians have relooked at these sort of claims these anti-slavery Republicans were making in the 1850s and 60s, and they actually found found a lot of evidence to support these claims. So we're going to go over some of the ways that pro-slavery politicians used the institutions of the federal government to perpetuate slavery in the United States and the early republic. So the first and obvious point is that pro-slavery politicians controlled the presidency for the vast majority of the early republic. And this is sort of very obvious within our first 5 presidents in the United States were all from Virginia and were all pro-slavery politicians and plantation owners, with the exception of John Adams, who only served 1 term. But George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, all planters personally involved with slavery and wanted to use the federal government to expand slavery, especially Jefferson through Monroe, roughly 1800 to 1821. And this also meant that because pro-slavery politicians controlled the presidency, they could also appoint people to the other executive offices who had power to promote the expansion of slavery. So, for instance, the Department of State was controlled by pro-slavery politicians throughout the entire early republic, and these people advocated for foreign policy that would support the expansion of slavery throughout the Americas. And so we talked about this in our previous lecture about how around this time you had the Haitian Revolution happen that's completed in 1804, and as a black revolutionary republic, it is not supported by the United States because the United States at the time and throughout the vast majority of the years of the First Republic was dominated by pro-slavery politicians who refused to recognize Haiti as an independent state because they're worried that the Haitian Revolution might inspire rebellions to try to end slavery in the South. And so this control that pro-slavery politicians had over the presidency had a real impact on American history. But arguably, the control of pro-slavery politicians over the legislature was even more pernicious. As you'll remember, we discussed the Three-Fifths Compromise. And the Three-Fifths Compromise was a part of the Constitution that granted extra representation for states that had people who were enslaved. And so 3/5 enslaved peoples were counted as 3/5 for the purposes of determining representation, or how many representatives a certain state gets to send to Congress. So what that means is that states like Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, eventually Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, all get more representation, extra representatives in Congress compared to northern states that abolished slavery. So it strengthens the political power of southern states against that of northern states. And this political power greatly matters because this extra representation actually becomes very important for the passage of legislation that is more pro-expansionistic against native nations. We're going to talk about the Indian Removal Act and go over the sort of detailed votes on that later on in this lecture, but also for expanding slavery. And that creates a bit of a problem, right? Because if pro-slavery politicians are able to use their extra representation to expand slavery west, that just allows them to then use that advantage in the Constitution, that the Three-Fifths Compromise, to elect more pro-slavery representatives to then enact a more pro-slavery policy in the United States. And that's kind of what you see, in the 1790s and the 1800s. There was sort of a sense by even pro-slavery people at the time that slavery was not a good institution. It was probably going to die out by itself, And they didn't want to do anything actively to get rid of it, but they weren't going to necessarily push it. And so George Washington, while he personally is involved in the institution of slavery, he doesn't really enact significant pro-slavery policies. Thomas Jefferson enacts some, like for instance not recognizing Haiti, but doesn't push it that far. However, as time goes on and slavery expands west slowly but surely, you have more pro-slavery politicians adopting more radical stances, not just saying things like, slavery is a necessary evil, but saying things like slavery is a positive good, which is an argument that John C. Calhoun from South Carolina makes. And this extra representation in Congress leads to pro-slavery politicians, again, adopting more radical views. And eventually, when party politics sort of changes, the advantage that pro-slavery politicians have in the Democratic Party, in the Jacksonian Democratic Party, also gives them a strong advantage. So even after there's substantial immigration into the North, which increases the population of the North and therefore increases their representation in Congress, because pro-slavery politicians are able to control party platforms and who to send as a nominee for president, they always make sure to send pro-slavery nominees to the presidency, even if those presidents aren't personally involved with the institution of slavery. But nonetheless, actually, if you go through the list of pro-slavery presidents, it basically, with the exception of John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams, every single president up until 1850 personally was involved in the institution of slavery, personally enslaved people. So the amount of control that these pro-slavery politicians have in the early republic is pretty substantial. And one sort of quick example to show that is the question of the Missouri Compromise. So Missouri petitions to join the United States around 1820, and Missouri ended up having immigration from mainly parts of the South. But Missouri itself is actually not really suited towards plantation agriculture. You can't actually grow cotton there or tobacco, or only a little bit of tobacco there. So it's not really suited for the type of plantation slavery that much of the South is practicing. Nonetheless, because it's settled by mostly pro-slavery Americans, they petition Congress to join as a slave state, or as a state that legalizes slavery. And a sort of obscure representative named a guy named Talmadge from Pennsylvania actually proposed an amendment to admit Missouri as a state, but admit Missouri as a state that's going to be free, where slavery, excuse me, where slavery is going to be banned. And this just starts a huge firestorm in Congress and a massive debate over whether to accept Missouri as a state with slavery or not. And there's even another representative from New York, John Taylor, who proposes that Arkansas, which is a state that was quite suited to growing cotton, also be let into the United States only as a free state, a state where slavery is banned. The interesting thing, if you look at the votes as to how people in Congress voted whether to admit Missouri and Arkansas as slave states or free states, the representatives that were granted to southern states by the 3/5 compromise make the difference between whether these states are admitted as states with slavery. And so Missouri and Arkansas are both admitted to the United States as states where slavery is allowed due to the impact of the 3/5 compromise. If the 3/5 compromise did not exist and representation was decided on simply regular populations, and enslaved peoples were not given the sort of extra or rather, white planters were giving extra power by counting people who were enslaved, slavery would have stopped at the Mississippi River, with the exception of Louisiana. And that's a big deal because that means Western expansion would have been blocked off, for slavery. And so um, the amount of power that pro-slavery politicians had on the politics of the early republic through the way the Constitution was designed, and also through perpetuating using that advantage they had from the Constitution and increasing their power in U.S. politics, it was fairly substantial. Pro-slavery politicians controlled U.S. politics in the early republic from 1787 all the way up until roughly 1860. So, what were these lands that were sort of very coveted by plantation owners in the South? Well, the cotton lands were not only in South Carolina and North Carolina, but they were in lots of strong and powerful native nations in the Southwest. And they were in, for instance, the Creek Nation in modern day Georgia and Alabama, the Cherokee in modern day northern Georgia, and the Choctaw and Chickasaw in Mississippi. And so if you look at this old map I have right here, you can see in blue these lands right here, kind of in the center of the American South, were actually very, very rich, had very rich soils, and were very, would be excellent at growing cotton. And so Southern planters really coveted this land, and they really wanted to expand into this territory. And so it promoted the expansion of the United States into native territory, into Choctaw and Creek and Chickasaw land. And this kind of area is what eventually becomes what gets called ironically as like the Old South, right? But in fact, it's actually incredibly new. People don't like the United States doesn't expand into this territory until the 1820s, 1830s. The Civil War happens just 35 years later. This was a new place that cotton plantations were being set up. The other thing that the sort of change of cash crops from tobacco and rice into cotton, the other sort of effect it has on slavery as an institution is it promotes the interstate slave trade. And I talked about this briefly in Unit 2, but since you cannot grow cotton in Northern Virginia or, for instance, Maryland, or many parts of North Carolina, it actually promotes Virginia, these sort of upper South states, to sell enslaved peoples down to the cotton lands in the South. And this leads to a massive movement of enslaved peoples from Virginia and Maryland into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and down into Louisiana. And so this is where a lot of that family separation occurs, and you could have families broken up routinely as plantation owners in Virginia seek to make a profit by selling people, selling human beings. So practically what this also did was give a strong financial incentive for Southern planters to violate federal treaties that the federal government had made with Native nations in these cotton lands and these areas, which would be incredibly profitable for them to have. So at the end of the War of 1812, which we talked about in our previous lecture, there was actually a civil war in the Creek Nation called the Red Stick War, and it was between two sets of Creeks. One who was more elite and had actually assimilated into partly assimilated into American society. Many of these elite Creeks learned English. They also started adopting plantation agriculture and started adopting slavery as well, chattel slavery, and engaged in the slave trade and enslaved people to work these larger plantations. And they were often more assimilationist. And so wanted to establish more diplomatic relations with the United States and more accommodationist towards the United States. The Red Sticks were a group of Creeks who were more traditional and advocated actually more oppositional politics against the United States and advocated to actually fight the United States and to try to hold on to different lands within the Creek Nation. So the U.S. actually gets involved in the Red Stick War, in this Creek Civil War, with the federal government and the U.S. military actually joining the side of the assimilationists to fight the Red Stick Creeks, which results in lots of Red Stick towns being attacked by the U.S. and the assimilationist Creeks, and many of these towns being destroyed. And in the end, this alliance doesn't actually help the assimilationist Creeks. So the assimilationist Creeks are thinking, if we can preserve good relations with the United States, they'll let us keep some of our land. That doesn't really happen. And what you actually see in this war is the U.S. Army be actually quite indiscriminatory in terms of who they target, and so they often actually attack the towns of the Allied Creeks who actually support the U.S. And following the war, they seize a significant amount of territory, including the territory of the assimilationist Creeks. And so it's really a devastating war for the Creek Nation, which leads to Georgia, the state of Georgia, getting significant amounts of Creek territory for white Southern planters to go in and set up their new plantations and expand slavery west. And at the same time, while Southern planters are seeking to expand into territories in the Southwest, Northern farmers are also coveting land of Algonquin nations in the modern-day Midwest. And so remember, the sort of Algonquin nations of the Shawnee, the Miami, the Lenape, lost a lot of territory in Ohio, but they settled in Indiana and parts of Michigan and parts of Illinois. And the United States also wanted to expand into those regions as well. And so we'll talk about the Trail of Tears and what happens to both of these groups of native nations a little bit later. But again, as I stressed in the previous lecture, sort of settler colonialism gets adopted as a U.S. policy following the American Revolution, and it only gets adopted more and more as time goes on. Presidents in the 1820s and 1830s are a lot more expansionistic against native nations than presidents in the 1790s. And slavery is providing one key strong financial incentive for the U.S. to act this way. So one place the United States sought to expand slavery was into the territory of Florida in the late 18 teens. So Florida was actually acquired really from Spain by the United States. In 1819, it's a little bit complicated. There was a West Florida, there was an East Florida. You had to have sort of separate treaties for it. But this was a place where Georgian planters sought to expand cotton growing and plantation agriculture into northern Florida. And this really ended Spanish colonial rule in Florida, which had been there since the establishment of St. Augustine in the 1550s, right? So this was sort of a very long time period where Spain had a presence there. But when the United States sought to expand into this region, they ran into a group of people called the Seminole. And the Seminole Nation was actually created as an offshoot of the Creek Nation after the Red Stick Wars, arguably a little bit earlier. And Seminoles had a very different sort of relationship with slavery as an institution. So unlike the Creeks and the Cherokees and the Choctaws, some of whom had adopted slavery as an institution like other white planters, Seminoles on completely rejected slavery as an institution. They had a lot more sort of in common with those traditional Creeks, the Red Sticks who we were talking about previously. And so the Seminoles fought an incredibly long war with the United States that arguably started around 1817, 1818, and lasts all the way into the 1840s. And so the Seminoles actually welcome people who ran away from plantations, people seeking their freedoms. And so African Americans actually assimilate into Seminole society and become Black Seminoles. And so even as the communities aren't like fully integrated necessarily, the Seminole Nation becomes a multiracial society that fights against the United States to hold on to their land in Florida while simultaneously fighting against slavery and encouraging enslaved peoples to come to the Seminole Nation and set up new lives there. And this was sort of one of the most prominent wars at the time that lasts for decades as Seminole fighters learn how to hide out in Florida swamps, lure U.S. Marines and the U.S. Army into ambushes where they're actually quite successful at holding out against the United States. And so this sort of is a place where this sort of expansion of the United States and the expansion of plantation-style slavery really hits a wall. And it's against a multiracial society that's effectively fighting for freedom. And so while this isn't sort of incredibly important to understanding sort of larger questions of slavery in the U.S., I think it's really important to look at these cases of resistance and to show that there were other ways here, right? The United States did not need to go full in on slavery. You had other examples of multiracial societies that resisted this version of the United States. So Andrew Jackson was actually one of the members of the expeditions to fight against the Seminoles in Florida. And I think it's worth just looking briefly into the life of Andrew Jackson here, because his legacy is so incredibly important for understanding why the United States becomes what it does by the 1830s and 1840s. So the U.S. was already on a very sort of pro-slavery course before the presidency of Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson sort of intensifies previous existing trends towards the removal of Native American populations and the expanding of slavery militaristically into the West. And so Andrew Jackson was a prominent planter from Tennessee. And Tennessee was one of the first sort of Western states admitted into the United States, and it was a state that was admitted as a slave state, where there was significant growing of tobacco and especially cotton in the 1800s. And so Andrew Jackson owned a plantation in Tennessee, and his sort of plantation house and mansion still exists today. You can actually go visit it today. It's called Hermitage, and it's outside of Nashville. And Andrew Jackson, as sort of a prominent Southern planter, sought to expand his holdings. He wanted to get more land so he could buy and enslave more people to work this land and make a bigger profit for himself and his family. And he actually, while being in the military, he sort of surveyed the lands as he was fighting, and so he actually participates in the Red Stick War that I mentioned, that civil war within the Creek Nation, and he actually purchased land in Alabama, which he had helped the United States seize from the Creek Nation during the Red Stick War, and so though there's sort of in a lot of historians have kind of older historians talked about Andrew Jackson as like being a champion of the working man or something like that, or a populist, which to some degree he was. His personal background was as a Southern planter. That's how he made his mark in politics, as governor of Tennessee, and as a prominent plantation owner in Tennessee. So Andrew Jackson's presidency, which begins in 1829, actually makes some major changes to the American political system. So before Jackson's presidency, the first party system, which is a term that historians use to describe how politics worked in the early republic, parties were divided between Democratic Republicans and Federalists, and eventually sort of Federalists die off, and then you just have one huge party called the Democratic Republicans. And in this political system, lots of people don't have the right to vote. You generally need property in order to have the right to vote, and that ironically that actually allowed space for people who were not white men to actually vote. So if you had enough property in order to vote, and you're African American, you can actually vote in many northern states in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Women could actually vote in New Jersey until the early 1800s if they had enough property under their names. So this sort of system was definitely more classist and less race and gender based in terms of voting rights. But as the United States expands westward, many of these western states adopt more liberal voting laws, which allows people without property to vote. However, when they're allowing for people without property to vote, they specifically start codifying that you have to be a white man to vote. And so this is how voting becomes both racialized and also restricted by gender. And so, ironically, as the sort of voting population expands, the kinds of people who could vote get narrowed. And so Andrew Jackson sort of intensifies this, because in the election of 1828, he is actually elected with a lot of support from lower class white men, primarily from the West. And again, this is despite the fact that Andrew Jackson himself is a rich Southern planter, but he appeals to these poor people out West with sort of very populist tactics, saying, you can become rich just like I am. We just need to get more land. We need to expand west against native nations faster, and we need to enable people to engage in slavery a little bit more easier, and so that you can engage in the institution of slavery, purchase people to work your plantation, and get rich yourself. And many Westerners and Southerners, white Southerners and white Westerners, find this message very appealing. And so Andrew Jackson actually sort of inaugurates what historians call the second party system. And the second party system is when a new political party emerges called the Whigs. And so you have the Democrats and the Whigs that compete in federal elections. And the big difference between these two political parties is economic questions. Whether the United States is going to heavily regulate the financial sector, or have a national bank, or have high tariffs. And that's something I'm not going to get into detail in this lecture. But I encourage you to read the American Yap, Chapter 7. It has a very good sort of summary of the debates over the Bank of the United States, the introduction of the spoil system, which is essentially Andrew Jackson bringing all of his political allies and people who worked on his campaign to come work in the federal government. This is kind of where that system gets started. And so I encourage you to read sections on that. But these are some important consequences of Andrew Jackson's presidency. Of course, Andrew Jackson's most controversial policy, both considered today by historians and actually at the time, was the Indian Removal Act, or the forcible removal of many Native American nations, not only in the Southwest, but also in the Northwest. And we'll talk about all these nations in detail. So to start, I wanted to give a little bit of background about what led to the Indian Removal Act. So in the 1820s, the state of Georgia sought to expand into Creek and Cherokee territory. Again, their purpose on this is to try to get a hold of that very rich land that enslavers and plantation owners could use to grow cotton. And so you have a bunch of border disputes right here between the state of Georgia and the Creek Nation and the Cherokee Nation. And the Cherokees and the Creeks know at this point they're not going to be able to militarily resist the United States. The U.S. at this point is just far too powerful. And so what you get is significant pressure from American settlers and from the Georgian government on the Creek Nation to cede territory to the state of Georgia. So for an example, William McIntosh was a prominent Creek politician, and he actually had relatives in the Georgia state government. And he ends up signing a treaty with the state of Georgia, selling all Creek Nation holdings in Georgia. So all the land of the Creek Nation that was historically in Georgia, which is a significant portion of their territory. And he does this with no support within the Creek towns or within the Creek national government. And so as we sort of previously talked about in many lectures, the Creek traditionally are a matriarchal society. Creek towns should be making these political decisions, but those Creek National Councils were set up by McGillivray and centralized Creek power. But William McIntosh didn't even have the support of those national councils, and so for his sort of betrayal of the Creek Nation, Creek leaders actually sentenced him to death for breaking the law of selling the land without Creek governmental consent, and they actually execute him shortly thereafter. So by the late 1820s, both the Creek Nation, Cherokee Nation are passing laws to ban the private sale of their tribal lands without government authorization, and they're beginning to enforce them, which makes it harder for states like Georgia to browbeat these nations into selling their territory, or to come up with these like corrupt deals with unscrupulous people who essentially sell out their nation. But Georgia has a problem, because the problem is traditionally only the federal government had the power to sign treaties with Native American nations. State governments were generally not allowed to do so. In Georgia, by signing these treaties, are essentially kind of pushing the limits of federal law. And so this creates a strong incentive for the supporters of Georgia and the supporters of this sort of rapid expansion into native land to create legislation like the Indian Removal Act, which will authorize states to remove Native American peoples from their land and or from the land they claim to own, which they actually don't. The Indian Removal Act is essentially a piece of legislation that is meant to sort of confer power onto states that seek a more expansionistic policy. So Andrew Jackson, as a strong supporter of removing Native Americans from their land, seeks to sort of adopt this very extreme view to authorize states to expel Native American nations. And so he supports and encourages the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, one of the key part of his presidency, shortly after he takes office. And so in doing this, he's responding to the political pressure of the people who elected him, those white plantation owners in the South who want that agricultural land to grow cotton and expand slavery. And the interesting thing is that the Indian Removal Act is incredibly controversial and faces a series of very close votes in the Senate and in the House. And so first, it does successfully pass in the Senate, but it's actually opposed by most of the North, including the state of Ohio. Both of Ohio senators actually oppose the Indian Removal Act, to their credit. And what's often forgotten in this question about the Indian Removal Act is that the Trail of Tears did not only occur in the Southwest, did not only occur against the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Creek, but also occurred to was applied to Native American tribes in the North. So those alliances of Ohio tribes, the Shawnee, the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Wyandot, these were all groups that were subjected to the Indian Removal Act. So politicians in the Midwest had a strong incentive to support this because it meant more land for their citizens. And in Ohio, there were multiple reservations. And the Miami and the Shawnee and the Wyandot still had land in Ohio that was in that northwest area around modern-day Toledo. So sort of to the credit of Ohio senators at the time, they actually opposed this act, and they saw it as a brutal, radical act that was unnecessary. However, in the House of Representatives, the vote was actually very, very close. So the Indian Removal Act was passed in the House of Representatives by 101 representatives against 97. So it passed by 4 votes, with 11 representatives not even choosing to vote. And we talked about the 3/5 compromise and the sort of political stranglehold that white planters and supporters of slavery had on the political system. Well, it matters here too. Without the 3/5 compromise, the Indian Removal Act would never have been passed, because that extra representation that states like Virginia and South Carolina and Tennessee got allowed them to have enough votes to pass the Indian Removal Act and then expand slavery into new lands and then get more representatives to then protect slavery more on the federal level. So the politics of slavery and how slavery is represented in Congress, determined by the Constitution, has a strong impact into how radical the U.S. policy gets. And you can see here on these vote counts here, South Carolina and Tennessee, excuse my very poor drawing. South Carolina and Tennessee vote nearly unanimously in support of the Indian Removal Act. The only person who actually votes against it in Tennessee is Davy Crockett. Yes, that Davy Crockett, the frontiersman who actually ends up dying in the Battle of the Alamo in the Mexican-American War. And you can see over here on the right, the vast majority of Ohio representatives voted against this act, whereas the vast majority of representatives from Virginia voted for it. So what you're seeing here is that Andrew Jackson, with the support of plantation owners and people who support slavery and pro-slavery, or at least people who are neutral on slavery in the West, with the support of Westerners and Southerners, Andrew Jackson is able to pass the Indian Removal Act barely. And this is what inaugurates this incredibly radical policy. So, how do Native nations respond to the passage of the Indian Removal Act? Well, several Native nations actually start to get involved with a legal battle against this act, because again, traditionally the federal government only had the authority to make treaties with Native American nations, and the Cherokee in particular know this. There was a prominent Cherokee leader, John Ross, took over was elected to the presidency of the Cherokee Nation, and John Ross was fluent in English, knew the law in and out, and formulated a legal strategy to try to attack the Indian Removal Act by going through the U.S. court systems and appealing directly to the Supreme Court. And so Ross found that there was a white missionary who was living in the Cherokee Nation at the time by the name of Samuel Worcester. And Samuel Worcester was actually working within the Cherokee Nation. He helped to found the Cherokee Phoenix, which was the first Cherokee language newspaper. And Ross and Worcester noticed that there was a law passed in the state of Georgia prohibiting unlicensed white men from living on Cherokee Nation territory. And Samuel Worcester, was actually arrested by Georgia authorities for violating this law, for choosing to reside on the Cherokee Nation. And so what both Worcester and Ross realized is that they could use this case to challenge the right of Georgia to treaty make or interact directly with the Cherokee Nation. Because basically, Georgia, by arresting Worcester, was saying that Georgia's state law is supreme over Cherokee Nation law. And so the Cherokee Nation used this case to say, no, Georgia has no sovereignty over the Cherokee Nation. Only the federal government can enter in negotiations with the Cherokee Nation. And so the Cherokee Nation works this case through the U.S. legal system and appeals the case all the way to Supreme Court, arguing again that Georgia has no authority within the Cherokee Nation. And eventually, this case reaches the Supreme Court, which is run by Chief Justice John Marshall at the time, who is not necessarily supportive of Andrew Jackson's policy. And Marshall rules, in fact, that only the federal government can negotiate directly with Native American nations. And this is a key important legal ruling that actually affects Indian law today. And so this Worcester v. Georgia actually creates a legal and formalized precedent for a nation-to-nation relationship. So it says that only the federal government has the right to negotiate directly with Native nations. And in fact, Worcester v. Georgia that influences the sort of recent Supreme Court rulings, like McGurk v. Oklahoma, which actually recodified or reestablished the Cherokee Nation and Creek Nation, Muskogee Nation reservations in Oklahoma. And so this ruling says Georgia does not have authority over the Cherokee Nation. They cannot negotiate treaties with the Cherokee Nation, which means they cannot steal, legally gain title to Cherokee Nation land. And Chief Justice Marshall says, this ruling would invalidate the many provisions of the Indian Removal Act. But quite controversially, Andrew Jackson says he is not going to enforce this Supreme Court ruling. And according to modern-day legal scholars, this is an illegal action. Presidents are required to execute and follow Supreme Court rulings, and Andrew Jackson refuses to, basically. Says, Georgia, you can do whatever you want. Disregard the Supreme Court decision. And one reason why Andrew Jackson allows the state of Georgia and his political allies to execute the Indian Removal Act against the Supreme Court ruling is because there's strong political incentives for him to do so. There's a massive pressure of settlers, both in the North and the South, to enact the Indian Removal Act. And so you not only had Southern planters and white Southerners who wanted this to happen, you had white Northerners in Indiana and Illinois who also supported this very radical policy. You also had investors. You had large land companies which were expecting the selling of millions of acres of lands, and people had already actually invested in these land companies to support the removal of Native American nations. And so you had lots of political pressure to enact to go ahead and execute this Indian Removal Act. This sort of leads to significant settler violence against Creeks, Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws on the border of their nation by American settlers who start stealing land. And the sort of inauguration of this violence really forces these nations into very difficult decisions. They could sort of continue this legal strategy, but as time goes along, they're worried that they might not even get support to relocate to or have land in new land in what's going to be called Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma, where the Indian Removal Act was forcing these people to go. And so there are some groups that actually signed treaties fairly early in this process, worried that if they don't cooperate with the U.S., they could actually have their people killed and not safely survive as a nation. And so this makes these sorts of debates were very difficult in these nations. It was because some of these people who are arguing for cooperation were seen as traitors, while others are saying, look, there's nothing we can do. We cannot fight against the United States. So it's best to make sure we save as many lives as possible. So nation by nation, state by state, the process of expulsion begins. And this affects all the nations in very different ways, depending on whether the military forces responsible for these long journeys of refugees from these nations out west are responsible and capable people, or whether they are not, whether they're neglectful or not organized, or whether they are simply actually want Native Americans to die on these incredibly long, arduous treks. So, to give a quick examples, the Indian Removal Act gets enforced on the Shawnee, who are forced to remove from their territories in sort of outside of modern day Toledo, and a group of 800 are sent to Kansas. So they follow that blue line all the way to Kansas. This is a journey of hundreds and hundreds of miles across very difficult terrain. This group that leaves and that's forced out of their homes against their will is subjected to bitter cold. There's an outbreak of cholera in the camps as they're moving across the modern day large parts of modern day Midwest. And of the group of 800, only 626 survive. 182 were reported missing. Most of them, of those 182, probably die. So roughly 8 out of 6, 3 out of 4 of the group originally make it to 25% death rate from this policy. And I want to sort of emphasize from this policy that even the neighbors of the Shawnee at the time in Ohio opposed, and that's forced on the Shawnee. In 1832, the expulsion of Choctaws occurs from the Choctaw Nation around modern-day central Mississippi and from their traditional homelands. Dozens die during the trip, mostly due to cholera, because they're forced onto steamboats on the Mississippi River, and they're forced onto these incredibly crowded conditions. 20% of the population of this group dies by 1833 after arriving west due to lack of government resources and simply not enough time to grow food. It's worth mentioning that the lands that all these nations are forced to settle on in modern day Oklahoma are very marginal lands. You can grow stuff there, but it's quite difficult. So if you don't have enough time to set up to grow food on this new land that was set aside, people are going to die, and the United States government does not provide enough food for people to live. The expulsion of the Cherokees occurs later, around 1837, 1838. And notoriously it occurs at the point of the bayonet by Georgia militia, who are now enforcing this against the rules set down by the Supreme Court. They're going against the laws. I think the case of Worcester v. Georgia. And during this time, Cherokee men, women, and children are forced into holding camps and forced to sit there under horrible conditions during massive rains, snows. There's a regular stealing of possession of Cherokees as white settlers and Georgia militiamen literally loot the possessions of these refugees. Among around 15,000 Cherokees, around 1,000 confirmed deaths during the expulsion, probably around 3,500 actual deaths. So again, you're talking about roughly 1/5, a little bit more over 1/5 of the population is killed as a part of these. It's part of the Trail Tears, and I want to mention as well. It's worth calling this. It's not just a trail of tears. It is many, many trails of tears of Native Americans in the North and of Native Americans in the South. Um, and so this is a radical policy that some actual modern American historians, including one historian named Claudio Sant, actually argues is a huge break from the previous policies of the United States, because while the United States previously fought in brutal wars against Native American nations and did expel Native American nations from their lands, they did not directly often target individual Native Americans from living in the United States. And that's what makes this policy a little bit different. Even if Cherokees and Creeks and Chickasaws and Choctaws wanted to assimilate and continue to live in these states, by this law they were not allowed to. They were forcibly expelled and targeted for who they were. And so Claudio Sant argues this is a huge break from traditional U.S. practice. I think the argument there's sort of a strong point to this argument. You can kind of go back and forth on it, though. The U.S. was pretty brutal against Native nations in the years leading up to this. But regardless, this was at minimum a policy of mass ethnic cleansing. You can make an argument for a policy of genocide. So I want to sort of leave us with a quote from John Ross, the chief of the Cherokee Nation. And so he stated, after these explosions took place, "We are despoiled of our private possessions, the indefeasible property of individuals. We are stripped of every attribute of freedom and eligibility for illegal self-defense. Our property may be plundered before our eyes, violence may be committed on our persons, even our lives may be taken away, and there is none to regard our complaints. We are denationalized, we are disenfranchised, we are deprived of membership in the human family. We have neither land, nor home, nor a resting place that can be called our own." So, I would argue essentially this is the legacy of Andrew Jackson. It is the Indian Removal Act, and it's the Trail of Tears, and it is the mass expulsion of Native Americans to enable the expansion of slavery. So this has been a bit of a depressing lecture. But I think this is sort of really important to understand what the United States was and the actions it committed between 1800 and 1830 and why it committed them. So that's going to conclude this lecture. For the next unit, we are going to take a look into sort of what happens in response to this. Because I don't want to leave you with an impression that this was inevitable, because it was not. Remember, the Indian Removal Act was only passed by 4 votes. Remember, there were lots of dissenting voices arguing against the perpetuation of slavery and for the following of human rights. And what's interesting is, sort of in response to the Indian Removal Act and to the sort of strategies of the Cherokee Nation, you have a dissenting radical movement that begins to argue for anti-slavery and for human equality that emerges in the 1830s and 1840s. And so in the next lecture, we're going to take a look into who are the dissenters of the system that was created in the First Republic, that's super expansionistic, that's very pro-slavery. Who's arguing against this? And what are they saying? Because it's these people and these dissenters who actually create the political conditions to challenge this pro-slavery First Republic, and that eventually lead to the election of Abraham Lincoln and the emergence of the Republican Party, and a sort of radical break in the country that leads to the Civil War. In sort of combination with the radicalism of people who are pro-slavery. So we're going to look at that this movement of dissenters for the next lecture. So thank you very much, and that will